the Civil War, which ended slavery and gave citizen rights, or the Civil Rights, which ended discrimination and segregation, that the structure of racism continues to exist today, that our community structure is still based on a racial hierarchy. So it's comprised of laws, a social narrative that explains those laws, which is the message, right? You can see what the message is under slavery. You can see what the message is under Jim Crow. You can see what the message is today under race-neutral policies. Any of that look familiar? Right? So we spent some time really going into that. And so what we've learned is that racism is a structure, right, that serves political and economic elites to maintain the power structure, right? And that with that comes some stories about how we talk about each other in terms of who we are and what that looks like, which then translates into individual attitudes and behaviors of ignorance and hate. So with that understanding of structural racism, it gives us a platform with which to put this research. What we know, because we are now in the manifestation of racism that comes out as race neutral, in other words, we can't legally discriminate against people, we can't legally say that this policy is going to affect people of color, but what we are hearing are things like, I'm colorblind, right? Or I'm going to treat everybody equally. Or if that person would just change their behavior, everything would be okay. These stories come out of the current iteration of racism in its race neutral form, because the impact of these attitudes and behaviors actually perpetuates racism. And so when we hear that and we see that, we can begin to say, we need to have a different conversation. We need to go a little bit deeper. We have provided to our community a one-page history of racism and race relations in our community. And what this has given us, because most of us were immigrants to Broward County. When I do the training and we ask the question, how many are from Broward County? Less than 5%. So we don't really know the history of Jim Crow. We don't really know how the educational systems and the healthcare systems and the economic systems and the criminal justice systems got set up in two very different ways for people of color and for white folks, right? And so having that historical knowledge is really important to the work that we do. And I realize not everybody's a geek and going to read all that history, so that's why we put it on a one page. Here's where the rubber hits the road. So understanding the structural nature of racism, understanding the history of how it set up our community. This is a map of Broward County showing the three, and there are more, but these are the predominant Black communities that were created under Jim Crow that we've not yet recovered from. Right? So we've got down here in the bottom, West Park Carver Ranches, bought in 1940s by a white developer to bring up Black agriculture and domestic workers. In the center is Northwest Fort Lauderdale and Lauderhill, which was a Black community created through segregation and eminent domain, right? And then reinforced by people having to stay on their side of the railroad track. And then up at the top there, the darkest part is Collier City, which was created for Black agricultural workers. So when we look at the highest incidence of where Black children are being removed, where are we looking? Those neighborhoods. When we see the highest incidences of poverty, where are we looking, right? So structurally, through the laws and processes of Jim Crow, these conditions got set up, right? And so as we understand that, we want to be able to include that in any research work that we're doing. So our project is actually going to work with families in the center there, Northwest Fort Lauderdale, the 33311 and 13 zip codes, right? And so there are very important reasons for having that community be at the table as co-researchers. So a lot of times data and data opportunities are not perceived as opportunities to co-create equity. But when we understand that all of our processes have been raised up through this Jim Crow lens, through this racist lens, we can also say, how can we co-create equity in using data and data systems? So our research project is going to marry the integrated data system that we're building in Broward with people who have been through the system, both adults and young people who've been through the child welfare system as co-researchers, to create a different space in a different way, in a different feel to how data systems work and to how data is used. We actually piloted a community participatory action research project last year. We brought in young people who'd been in the juvenile justice system, young people who'd been through the child welfare system, young people who'd been through the behavioral health system as co-researchers. So we had 15 young people over a period of a year work with us to co-research in those areas. And one of the most profound learnings that came of that was to remember that a number is not a person, right? Or a data point is not a person. that somehow we have to build our institutions and our processes around the wholeness of who that person is, and not just go off of numbers by in and of themselves. And so we really have begun to consider how can we create spaces using data with people who are in the system or who have been through the system as co-researchers to help us redesign the system from the lens of who they are, right? And in partnership. And also create different kinds of relationships where it's not the expert or the researcher or the academic sort of doing the work to people, but really sitting at a table and designing a process together where we gather knowledge together, we look at the knowledge together, we create products together that will then go and change the system. When we did this process last year, as I mentioned, we had the young people, and as you know, young people, they'll come into the room, and the first thing they're going to do is sit in the chair in the corner looking at their phone with their head down, right? So that was our experience. By the end of this process, the young people were sitting in front of a juvenile justice judge and saying, here's a policy that doesn't work, right? Here are some solutions. Can you work with us to make a difference? And we've created some change in the juvenile justice system around the Failure to Appear Act. We've made recommendations in terms of having young people involved in the hiring of group home staff and the training of group home staff. So it was a process that built leadership skills, research skills in young people. Because my fear when we first started this process is you have young people who have no idea about research, and you've got PhD faculty. How are you going to bridge the gap, right? And we learned some things that will feed this project that we're coming into this year. So these were some of the products that came out of the research. So it wasn't just a report that a few folks read. It was really tools and information that had a wide applicability to the community as well as to the system partners and the work that we're doing. So this is really beginning to kind of say, what are the facets of community participatory action research? So this is what our project will be for this year. And again, we want to thank the Institute for the opportunity to bring this model of being co-researchers into the child welfare arena. And really not only produce system change recommendations and products and education, but also to create new relationships, new ways of relating between system partners and people who are in the systems, right? Because racism is a process that has dehumanized us. So how can CPAR be a process that rehumanizes us, right? That brings us back into contact with the humanity of both of us, the system partners, as well as the people who go through the systems themselves. So these are some of the facets of community participatory action research. We recognize that it's not your traditional quantitative crunching the numbers kind of process, but that it's really intended to engage people and have people at the table who typically aren't. So these are some of the key phases of the process and how it works. We are very fortunate. We found some folks, I think it'll be in the next slide, who have been doing this community participatory research in New York City. They're a group called and it's cut off here, but they're the Public Science Project. And they're out of CUNY, which is the City University of New York, and they have been doing these community-based research projects for decades, right? They did something called the Morris Justice Project, where they worked with community members in a 40-block radius in New York City around the stop and frisk policy and the police experiences that community members have to change that policy. They've worked with women in prison around education. So they have this ability to take people who have far-ranging research literacies and bring us all to the table and share our gifts and work together and honor what each person brings to the table. So we're bringing that process and bringing these folks back down to Broward to do this work in our child welfare system. This process will bring a critical lens. This process will raise questions that often aren't raised. We're going to look at power dynamics, right? We're going to look at what is objective data. We're going to look at not just how are we working with individuals, but how is this representing the system, right? And some of those laws and policies and how they're showing up. And so it's infused with this sort of critical creative lens about how do we recreate ourselves in a more equitable fashion. And so very concretely, we will be convening in July with 4 or 5 adults who have been through the child welfare system in the Northwest Fort Lauderdale area, where we will begin building relationships and designing research projects for the next year or so. And those questions, we've had lots of input from our system partners around what, aspects of the service system they want to look at. We'll present all of that, and then through that process of relationship building, the projects will get designed. From August through November, the teams we envision, because there'll be 20 of us, 2 teams that will be working on collecting data through interviews, focus group surveys. Now, we still bring our research expertise to the work, but it is at the table in a very different way, right? Then in December, the folks from the Public Science Project will come back, work with us around this process of what in traditional research is called data analysis. They've got a term called data whispering, where we look at the data in terms of what surprises us, what's similar, what's troubling, right? And so asking the questions from that different relational perspective. Once we've gone through that, what we saw emerge in our experience last year was some very concrete recommendations and system changes and stories to tell the community partners about how we can improve the experience of people who are in the system, right? And so then kind of bringing all of those to fruition by late spring, early summer next year. We'll have, as I said, 4 or 5 adults who have been through the child welfare system as co-researchers. We've reached out to some of the folks who've been identified. They are very excited to be at the table, to be a part of improving what they know they went through, so that the next family can have an even, a better experience. 6 young people who've aged out of the foster care system and sort of bringing in their perspective. All of the co-researchers will be paid, right, to ensure that there's equity in that process. And then we're going to have 10 system partners, which includes our investigators, it includes our community-based care organizations, some of our nonprofit service providers, as well as the Children's Services Council, where we provide a lot of prevention and front-end kinds of programs. So we can't tell you what the research questions are going to be today. We can tell you that we're going to engage a process with people who've been through the system to help us create a better child welfare system in Broward, and hopefully have some implications at the state level. So that is your whirlwind tour of Broward's Community Participatory Action Research Project. So I do think I have a minute or 2 for questions before I have to bounce. So any thoughts, comments, questions, things that you think would be helpful for us to know? You're smiling? Okay. Okay. Yes, sir. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Thank you. For those of you who may not have heard the question, it was, are we going to be looking at poverty and mixed income as a contributing dynamic in this process? So one of the things that we've learned, and there's a slide that I didn't include in the deck, is that racial segregation leads to concentrated pockets of poverty. A study out of the University of Michigan in Ferguson showed how racial segregation leads to lower home values, leads to lower business investment, leads to lower educational pieces, which creates concentrated pockets of poverty. So the answer to your question is, these neighborhoods, because of their residential racial segregation, will be pockets of concentrated poverty, right? Because that's how structural racism works. Racism and poverty go hand in hand. So thank you for your question. Yes.
You mentioned that when you approached your data integration,
yes,
that you knew you needed to do that with the racial equity lens.
Yes.
My question is, how did you know that? How did you? That's very insightful and innovative and wise and just.
Thank you.
And that's rare in terms of data integration projects, especially with child welfare and other sources. So I'm curious. How did that approach originate?
So when we got federal funding in 2016 for another grant, we built in money to build an integrated data system. And when we got that money, we applied for technical assistance from the University of Pennsylvania. They have an institute institute or a center called the Actionable Intelligence for Social Policy. Dennis Culhane and his team for the last 15, maybe 20 years have been studying how states and counties and municipalities have been building integrated data systems. And out of that studying of how communities are building integrated data systems, they have put together a technical assistance process to help new communities like Broward go through this 18-month process to learn how to do governance, to learn how to do research protocols, legal frameworks, which we all know is a challenge, and then the technology. So they had 4 pillars. And as we were going through the process, and I'm embedded in all of this racial equity education that we're doing and recognizing that, in Broward, as in all of our communities, the racial disparities are evident across all of the things. I recognized, and I looked around the room, and I'm like, this is a community structure that if we don't bring a racial equity lens to, will replicate racism. And so I said that to the director, Amy Hawn Nelson out of North Carolina, and she was like, yes, help us develop this lens. And so I was mentioning to Dr. Price that we're going to be this year through December working with that group to develop a 5th pillar of equity for building integrated data systems. And so this work that we're doing through the funding of the Institute plus our pilot are examples of how to bring this lens to the work. And so we're partnering with folks from Data for Black Lives, from other, Annie E. Casey, who've done some really good thinking around racial equity and this work to put together our best thinking now about what will equity look like in these integrated data systems. So we're sort of in the nascent phase of that, but it's critical because without it, we're just going to be perpetuating the very structures we want to undo. So thank you for your question. Yeah. Yes, sir.
I don't know if this is really, I was very taken by the demographic map you showed.
Yes.
Where they had, back in the days before integration, where we had the direct legal segregation by force. My background's history. I know how bad it was.
Yes.
I know how bad this state was. A lot of people have forgotten this state was a very, very hard, difficult state to integrate.
Yes.
And it took actions from the federal government 10 years after most of the South was already dealing with their situations. We were still hanging on.
That's
We
right.
kind of forget that now, looking around at us. But what I'm asking is, how do we break those last chains? Because the people that have, the white people, of which I'm one of, we're not going to voluntarily relinquish what we have. Not most of us. And how do we, if we can't shift the economic equity, we can't fix the problem.
Right. Thank you. I think we should give this guy a round of applause. So there's the micro and the macro level. Part of the reason why we are doing such intensive education for our community and investing significant money is so that we can even see how these structures are still showing up, right? And because most of us who are in this work want to help improve people's lives, we have to marry this knowledge of structural racism with our compassion. And then as white folks, we've got to really figure out how can we use the privilege that we have to co-create equity with people of color, right? And what does that look like? What does that feel like? And I know from our experience last year with the CPAR process, we felt that, right? It wasn't a academic and a system partner and a young person like at odds, but there were relationships that were built where I honored each of our experiences and saw how it complemented to come together. So it's a multifaceted, multi-strategy approach. It's education, it's building empathy, it's looking at data, and most importantly, it's building relationships using this critical lens. Because it's not just showing up and with our same lens of, I'm here to help you, I'm here to fix you, right? But showing up with the lens of how can we partner together? So as a human service provider, how do I see you not just as a client, not just as a patient, not just but as a person who can partner with me because your knowledge of what's working and not working in our systems is more than I will ever have, right? I may have some degrees or some expertise in my field, but you've got knowledge and relationships and people who are experiencing either what works in the system or what doesn't work. So how can we partner with every single person in our programs or our systems to partner with us to redesign those systems, right? To create new kinds of relationships. So those are some of the opportunities that we're exploring, and we're hoping this CPAR project is a way for us to further find language and create more spaces where we're building those kinds of relationships in partnership. Thank you.
Great job.
Thank you.
Great job. Now, Dr. Price, did you want to go ahead and we'll introduce our second grant recipient? Let me make sure I rated the right way. Our second grant recipient, Lori, let me get your name. Nope, I'm not going to do this. I left my thing here. Nope. USF, Lori Rower from USF Child and Family Studies. Thank you so
much. Hi, good morning, everyone. Can you hear me? Great. My name is Lodi Rohr, and I'm joined by my wonderful colleague, Dr. Roxanne McNeish. And we are from the Department of Child and Family Studies at the University of South Florida in Tampa. We are honored to be the recipients of one of the Racial Equity Grant Awards from the Institute. And our proposal was to examine racial disparities in the experiences and outcomes of crossover youth in the state of Florida. I'm just curious, how many of you have worked with CrossoverYouth? Show of hands. I'm going to define that next. So I just wanted to see if anyone was familiar with the term. So there are folks here who aren't familiar with it then. Okay, great. So I'm going to start out with defining some terms. We're going to talk a little bit about how these youth transition and bounce back and forth between the systems. I'm also going to present some data on demographic patterns and outcomes and best practices, but I'm going to be really careful not to give you analysis paralysis, which Corey mentioned yesterday, because I know that can happen. And then we're going to discuss our evaluation of Florida's specialized treatment programs for crossover youth. And then we're going to talk a little bit about what we have planned to do as part of the grant award. But as Dr. Price mentioned, we want to keep an open mind in terms of what we've proposed to do. We know that sometimes as researchers, we propose things that just aren't feasible. In our evaluation work, we've decided, okay, this sounds like a great idea. Let's go implement it. Let's go talk with families about their experiences. Well, that doesn't always work. And so we would like to hear from you, from those of you who have worked with this population, know more about them than we do as researchers, some approaches that we might want to consider, some things, some suggestions that you might have for us. So crossover youth refers to youth who are involved or who are at risk of involvement with both the child welfare and juvenile justice systems. In many cases, these youth have grown up in households where they have experienced abuse or neglect or other forms of trauma like domestic violence, and they have started to engage in delinquent behaviors. Most of the time, crossover youth is used interchangeably with these other terms, and I'm going to talk about some of the distinctions between those terms next. The Center for Juvenile Justice Reform distinguishes between crossover, dually involved, and dually adjudicated youth. And so they define crossover youth as a child who has experienced maltreatment and engages in delinquency. But a lot of other people define it a lot more broadly. And remember that definition I provided earlier. We like to conceptualize it as a child who is either involved or at risk of involvement in both systems. Dually involved has been defined as children with concurrent involvement in both systems to some degree, and dually adjudicated refers to those youth with formal involvement in both systems. So I think one of the biggest challenges to learning more about this population, working with them, and conducting research is that there are so many different terms and they mean different things to different people. And that's really due in part to the fact that these youth can enter the systems in a variety of ways. Most of the time we think about pathway 1, which is where a youth is in the child welfare system, they engage in delinquent behaviors, they get arrested, and then they move into the delinquency system. We know a lot more about that. A lot more research has been done on that particular pathway. But then there are these other pathways as well where the youth gets arrested first and then bounces into the child welfare system because of lockout or for other reasons. So I think having consistent terminology, knowing specifically about which population we're researching and working with is really important. So here's another representation of the pathways that looks at predictors of involvement and movement between the systems, the child welfare system, the behavioral health system, and the juvenile justice system. And you can see how all of these risks and outcomes interact with each other in very complex ways, which leads to a child bouncing back and forth between the systems. So what do we know about crossover youth? Well, first, we know that these youth enter the child welfare system at much younger ages, and they stay for much longer periods of time. They tend to be more likely to be female, although we have found some research that suggests this may not actually be true. Minorities, particularly Black youth, are overrepresented, and nationally, Black youth make up about 30% of the foster care population, but well over half, up to 60% of the crossover youth population. And this is even in spite of the fact that research suggests that Black youth in the child welfare system are not actually more likely to engage in delinquency. So we want to know, what are the reasons for this? Why are they overrepresented? Many have experienced multiple placements out of the home. They often skip school, they have poor grades, and they are chronic runaways. And they're perceived as higher risk and receive harsher dispositions and harsher treatments in out-of-home placements. Here's a really nice graphic from KC Family Programs that I borrowed, and I hope they don't mind, but I think it highlights some of these important indicators that we just talked about. We feel it's really critical as researchers to devote resources to helping this population, not only because they're bouncing back and forth between the systems and are difficult to track, but because they have such poor outcomes. We know that they have serious mental health challenges, educational and vocational challenges, higher rates of recidivism, longer stays in detention, poor placement and permanency outcomes. So what do crossover youth need? I think one of the most important things to consider is the fact that, am I too quiet? I'm so sorry. Is that better? Okay. There's definitely a need for coordinated case assessment, planning, and supervision. So I think, as Sue mentioned, having these integrated data systems where child-serving agencies can share information with one another is so critical in order to meet the needs of these youth. Family engagement in decision-making and focusing on youth and family strengths is important for ensuring safety and stability. We also need to have standardized risk assessment and needs assessment tools. And I'll talk about it in a minute, but with our evaluation, we've learned that when programs are using different ways of assessing youth, it leads to a lot of challenges as researchers in determining whether a program is successful or not, because we can't make comparisons across the programs. We also need evidence-based models and practices in place to the extent possible. So as I mentioned, integration of care, collaboration between agencies that interact with these youth is important because we want to know where these youth are going, where they've been, and they're likely to have contact with all of these systems. So we've got the courts, child welfare, juvenile justice, behavioral health, law enforcement, and education. I'd like to spend just a few minutes introducing you to the specialized treatment programs for crossover youth in Florida. In December 2017, the Department of Children and Families provided funding to 3 agencies to implement these interventions for crossover youth. The programs are the National Youth Advocate Program in Jacksonville, and Devereaux in Orlando, and Children's Home Society in Tampa. And before I go any further, I just want to say that these organizations have just been phenomenal in terms of assisting us with the evaluation. Their staff are so dedicated. Their leadership has dropped everything to give us the information that we need. I have never seen such dedicated staff working to help these youth. They are just phenomenal. So if we could just give them a round of applause to thank them for their hard work. Each of the programs is required to provide an array of individualized services, which are listed on the right. They all need to provide those services. And there are also several other requirements of their contracts, which is that they must serve 20 youth per month. The youth must be between the ages of 11 and 17. The youth do not necessarily need to be in either system, but they are at risk of being in one or both systems. Evidence-based practices should be implemented. And one of the most interesting requirements, and I think one of maybe the most challenging ones for the programs, has been that the treatment coordinators and the therapists must meet with the youth 3 times per week in person. So our team at USF was selected to evaluate these programs, and we're just finishing up some data collection and some preliminary analysis. So I didn't want to identify the programs yet because we're still collecting information and we wanted to keep it anonymous. But I wanted to provide you a little bit of information. We're finding that the referral source is typically DCF or a community partner like the schools rather than DJJ. And that's true across all of the programs. We found that 2 of the programs are serving more males than females, and we also found that the racial composition of youth served by each program varies dramatically. So we've got one program that's serving 70% of Black youth, and the others are much lower than that. And here's just a snapshot of a few other indicators for you. About 100 youth have been served by each program since it started in December of 2017. The youth are around 15 years old. And the mean number of days in the program ranges from 96 to 159 days. So that's anywhere from 3 to 5 months. And I think 6 months is about the maximum amount of time that the youth would stay in the program. The proportion of successful completion at discharge ranges from 22% to 61%. And I think this really was concerning to us. And we're taking a closer look at the possible reasons for this. And one thing that we've learned from our focus groups and in speaking with staff is that these multiple weekly meetings where they need to meet with the youth 3 times a week, sometimes families perceive that as inconvenient and intrusive, and it causes them to disengage early. So we're trying to figure out ways to engage families to figure out, what could be done in order to improve their engagement and make sure that that's not happening. But on the flip side, the proportion who are returning to the same or lower level of care is 70 to 90%, which is great. Yeah. The question was, how do you define successful completion, which I think is a very good question, and each agency defines it differently. And so they have met all of their treatment goals, and those treatment goals can vary from youth to youth, as you probably know. So they're scoring better on their assessments, whether it's the CBCL or the CANS or the CFARS. So I think that's another challenge, is we can't really say that youth in one program are performing better or doing better. They're discharged with fewer problems because each program does it differently. Very good question. So based on our preliminary findings from the evaluation, some of the recommendations that we've made are here up on the screen. We really feel like we need to have a standard protocol for collecting information on performance measures and other indicators. All the programs should be encouraged to use electronic records. And you might think that everybody uses computers these days and enters information into electronic records, but they do not. And that is a big problem. One of the agencies is transitioning, but is still using paper forms. So that means that as evaluation staff, we have to go there in person, we have to enter the data into a spreadsheet, and we have to take it back with us, which makes it time-consuming and challenging. It's hard for the staff because they can't see exactly what's been going on in real time. They have to flip back through paper. I'm sure you all know how challenging that can be. So. Treatment programs should agree on a common set of assessment tools and a schedule for administration because, as I mentioned, it's difficult to compare programs when different indicators are being used. And as I also mentioned, we also need to look at parent engagement and ways to encourage families to continue participating in an intensive program like this one. So we're very excited to build on these findings from the evaluation and continue working with the treatment programs thanks to the support of the Institute. And the purpose of our study is to examine racial disparities in the experiences and outcomes of crossover youth. And specifically, we want to know whether certain treatment models for crossover youth are effective in meeting the needs of minority families. And we're going to work with 2 of the specialized treatment programs. One of them has an initiative in place. It's a model called Constant and Never-Ending Improvement. And there's a lot of research support behind it. And we want to compare the outcomes and experiences of those youth involved in that program with a different program in which there isn't really a formal model in place, but services are being provided. So we want to try and see if there's a difference there. So as researchers in this field, we feel that having a mixed methods approach is very important. We don't just like to crunch numbers. I mean, I crunch numbers, sure, but I mean, the most informative piece of the evaluation for me was actually talking with people out in the field, learning from them, learning from their experiences. What are the things that are difficult for them? What is working for you? So we wanted to continue that approach for this study. We're going to do focus group surveys, case file reviews. We're going to analyze administrative data. And then some of our more specific research questions are listed up here. But as Dr. Price mentioned, and as I think I said earlier, we're very open to changing our questions, to modifying our approach. If anyone would like to weigh in on some of the things we've proposed to do and give us different ideas, we are definitely open to that. So I'm going to open up to comments, questions, suggestions, and thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Listen, I'm excited. I don't know about y'all. I'm excited to see what you all, the results are and what comes from this. What we're going to do right now is we're going to go ahead and I know we ate. Good breakfast? Breakfast was good? Real good? I didn't have any, so. But what we're going to do, we're going to take about a 5 to 10 minute break, about a 5-minute break. I say that, so we'll be back here by 10 minutes, right? And just stretch your legs. Bathrooms, again, are through the door right on the other side of the glass. Make a left. And immediately following upon your return, Dr. Price will go ahead and introduce our keynote today.
One, two.
We're going to reconvene. If people can start making their way back in and taking their seats, please. Kevin, would you mind telling the folks out that we're getting started? They might be still. Okay, thank you all for reconvening. I also wanted to let everyone here know that if you have to check out, we're working on extending your checkout till noon, just so you don't have to leave by 11 while Cattivo is still up talking. So if you're at this hotel, when he's finished, you can handle your checkout, and they'll be able to hold your luggage until we adjourn at 3. I just wanted to make sure I announced that. I also wanted to acknowledge the Institute affiliates. If you wouldn't mind standing, if you are an affiliate of our Institute. Dr. Perry is also, I'm acknowledging our Institute affiliates. He's coming in now. Can I give them a round? Can you all just give them a round of applause? Thank you for being here with us today. We have about 60 affiliates statewide, and our affiliates are really the brain of our Institute. When we get asks from the legislature about a particular topic, we lean on them, and we really appreciate them. If you have any interest in being affiliated with our Institute, come talk to me, and I can talk to you about, your roles and responsibilities and expectations and things of that nature. But we really enjoy engaging with them and being partners with them in our work. So thank you for being here. Okay, so it is my honor and privilege to be able to introduce Cattivo Wahid. I don't have a very long introduction. I know you have his abridged bio in your program agenda, but I did want to share that I used to work in New York State. I worked at the University at Albany, and a project that I led was going from county to county to county to county, interviewing staff and directors and supervisors to find out what they were doing about racial equity. And many counties got a grant from, I believe it was Casey, to start stimulating work around this issue. So it was my job to go out and kind of see, what did you do with your grant funding? Did it make a difference? What types of things were you engaged in? So one of the questions that I asked the focus groups and interviews one-on-one was, what was the catalyst? What got your workforce ready? What made the staff and the supervisors and the directors buy in? What was that one thing that brought it all together? And it was real. It was the racial equity learning exchange. Every single person said, Cattivo Wahid came, and that really kicked us off. And that's before I even knew who he was, but I kept hearing this name. So I just want to say, Cattivo has really, really impacted child welfare on multiple levels when it comes to racial equity learning exchanges. When we had a conversation last year about this event, and I kept calling it a training. I don't know if you recall this, but he said, it's not a training. He doesn't really word it that way. He says it's a learning exchange. So that's what I want you to continue to kind of think about. he's just not up here pontificating. He's learning from you, you're learning from here, we're gonna all learn from each other. So New York State is better for the better because of Cattivo Heed, and he has brought so much information to them, and it catapulted them ahead in many realms when it comes to racial equity work. So I just wanted to share that and be open to what he's saying. I also, if you are a director here or even a frontline worker, be thinking about how you can utilize Cattivo and his team for your teams back in your respective communities, and see about how we can continue to galvanize our state to move forward in this effort. So without further ado, Cattivo. You want to hold the mic or should I put it up here? Okay.
Good morning. Before I begin, can you all hear me? Before I begin, I want to start with the greetings of peace and extend those words to each of you, not only as a greetings, but really as a hope that each of you in your personal and your professional lives are finding and maintaining peace. All of us, I would suspect, came into the public field or to the public arena to serve, to help others, to make a difference. And the work that you do on a daily basis is extremely important, but it is extremely stressful. Working with the lives of families and children and trying to impact communities, working with your staff, working with community partners, takes a lot of work, a lot of effort. And we talk a lot about trauma-informed work. And I'm so pleased that we have finally gotten there. We've known about the issues of trauma since the 70s when work was done with Vietnam veterans, and in particular with women who were victims of domestic violence. But that was the 70s, and here we are almost 2020, and most of us with whom we work or even in this room are just now really becoming fully acquainted with that construct. That's more than 50 years later. But one of the important parts of trauma-informed work is the concept of secondary trauma and how we take care of ourselves. Being ready, being prepared, being fully present for each other and for the families and communities that we serve. And I often think about the relevance of that to the instructions that we receive when we board an airplane. And when I first heard those instructions, I thought to myself, boy, that's a selfish suggestion, where the airline stewardess would say something to the effect of, if there's turbulence or trouble on the plane, the air pressure drops, the mask will drop down, put your mask on first, and then the person next to you. Well, me being who I try to be, my thought was, why wouldn't I help the person next to me first? But as I thought about it, it made a lot more sense that I can be of more benefit to that person if I can be fully present for that person as well as myself throughout the process. And so in a sense, this notion of secondary trauma, helping each other, practicing mindfulness, self-care is really important. And so all of that is shrouded, if you will, in this greeting of peace. I want to acknowledge all of the funding partners, sponsors for this, but I first and foremost want to acknowledge Dr. Price. I think it's extremely important and extremely gratifying to know that there are emerging leaders like yourselves, but in particular, Dr. Price, who have grabbed onto this work and have begun to take it much further, particularly in the realm of research. We need to figure out what we know and what we don't know and why and how we need to do things better. But as I was listening to the presenters today, I was really encouraged listening to them as well as the panel and the speaker, Corey, yesterday. I mean, I was just really, really, really excited and impressed by the knowledge, by the passion, by the commitment, by the insight in their words. One of the things that comes up for me in all of this, as this work around equity spreads, is the need to make sure that this just doesn't become the new gimmick of the day. We have already so many tools to serve children and families and communities. We come up with them all the time. You know, there's just so much work that has been done around permanency roundtables and differential response, families first. We've got blind removals now. Those are all really, I really like the idea of blind removals. We've got adoption procedures. We've got subsidized guardianships. We've got a bunch of things. We've got knowing who you are. But none of those tools, in my humble opinion, are going to be as effective if we don't apply this notion of equity to it. And we come up with ideas all of the time, and we very rarely look at this issue of equity. So those of you all who are researchers in particular, I hope that you will find and take the time to really get into this work yourselves. It's one thing to espouse the need for racial equity. It's another thing to embody it. And so the persons who are actually conducting the research need, in my humble opinion, to take that journey themselves and to understand what the change process is like by looking in one's own self and using that to guide us as we go forward. I have, based on something that Dr. Price has said, you know, I've had the privilege and the responsibility to have been involved in this work for a really long time, actually. I was happy to see the Casey Family Programs was involved. I was actually involved at the ground level in 1999 in New York at the Aspen Roundtable on Comprehensive Community Initiatives, where a very smart bunch of people actually began to develop the definition for equity and a definition for structural racism at a time when, as a nation, we still weren't comfortable using the words race. We had to talk about cultural competence, cultural sensitivity, the kind of things that you heard yesterday from Corey and the panel and others. We had to use code language because we were in the middle of this whole race-neutral construct that basically said you can talk about some things, but race is not one of them. And so in 1998, 99, I had the privilege of going back and forth commuting in Manhattan, and we began to really struggle with what does racial equity mean and what's the difference between equity and racial equity. And to be mindful, I invite you all to be mindful of the slight distinction, because as I've been around the tables, I've seen that when whites are uncomfortable talking about race, they want to take the word race off of equity and just say equity. And it's the good part about that is that it includes those interests and needs that involve all of us. But once again, it hijacks, if you will, the narrative and the conversation about why we specifically need to look at the issues of race. And so I would invite you all to at least consider that when you are at the tables and this work is evolving and being implemented, that you make note of the difference of how often equity is used versus racial equity, and to be mindful about what your response to that would be. We are, I've heard yesterday and heard through many conversations over the years when we started the Alliance for Racial Equity and Child Welfare, which was a partnership with Annie E. Casey, Casey Family Programs, the Center for the Study of Social Policy, Marguerite Casey, Jim Casey, and some other entities, where we actually began to give a lot of attention to this issue and the conversations that I think have helped over time to advance this agenda to a place where you all have seen the need to take it further. And central to one of those discussions all the time was this issue about poverty versus race, and it has come up here today. And I can't even remember the exact way the question was raised yesterday, but basically, you know, when we say that, some of us will say, well, isn't it more about poverty rather than race? One of my responses to that is that if, in fact, the significant number of kids who come into care are coming in and they're poor, and we know that over 60% of the people who come into kids who come into foster care come for allegations and foundings of neglect and not actual physical abuse. Much of that neglect is rooted in poverty. And so the question that I would ask you all to answer yourselves is, if African Americans and children of families of color are more likely to be poor, why is that? So it's not a either or, as somebody said this morning. It is about asking, why are African Americans more likely to be poor? And I can't remember the young lady's name who opened up this morning, but she did an excellent job as well, basically in talking about how structural racism perpetuates poverty. And so it is that debate can be a useful one, but it can be a divisive one. It can be a misleading one. Yes, we definitely need to look at the issues of poverty, because for me, and hopefully for you, the child welfare system should not just be about safety for kids. And I think for too long, that's basically what it's been about. We do our best work around protecting kids. We're getting better at permanency, which is the second leg in that three-legged stool, but our focus on well-being has got a lot to be desired. Would you all agree? Yeah. And so part of the well-being piece to me is about addressing the issues of poverty. And some of the panelists and the speaker yesterday also, I think, very accurately talked about, my takeaway was almost as thinking of this as a continuum from, in terms of our responses or our work around child welfare, going from maybe one end of the continuum where we're putting together initiatives and programs, to maybe in the middle where we're looking to reform it, to the other end of the continuum where we want to transform it. And I think there's a place for all of those strategies. Change does not occur overnight. Somebody said yesterday that it's decades worth of work. I think it was the dean from the college, and I think he's absolutely right. And so recognizing that it is ultimately about transformation for many of us, then one of the basic questions in our realm of thinking is, so when we're approaching kids, and we do understand that disproportionality is a significant issue, as are disparities for kids and families of color. But I caution all of us to continue to think about, how do we create those reductions in a way that is safe? And what I mean by that is, we could cut off the number of kids coming into care and who's languish in care just like that. But are those the best approaches that we would be using in order to accomplish that? So I caution us to not fall too deeply in love with data, because data is important. It informs our thinking. It tells us what's wrong, what needs to be done. But I've seen in law enforcement, I've seen in schools, I've seen in child welfare, I've seen in a bunch of different systems, that if the public pressure is strong enough, folks will figure out ways to make the data look better, but the issues of well-being and safety are compromised. Are you all with me? Okay, now I'm gonna ask you that a lot, or either I'm gonna ask you if it makes sense, not because I think you all are slow. I'm gonna ask you that because I'm hoping that I'm making some sense. It depends on the day. I got you. So within that construct of, or that concept of that continuum, I invite us to think about the work from a perspective of, do we need a child welfare system, or do we need child welfare as a construct? And I think we need both, and here's why I say that, because unfortunately, there are children who need desperately our protection. In my humble opinion, there's no question about it. Now, where we place them, whether it's with relatives, or whether it's with strangers, or whether it's in a residential setting, is an important part of the debate. But there are children, for no reason of their own, who need our protection, and their family can't provide it. But a basic question for us should be, or for me, that I invite you to consider is, are we always removing the right children for the right reasons? I mean, with all due respect to anyone in here who may take offense to this, child welfare is a business. People make a living off of child welfare. We pay our mortgages, our car notes, we send our kids to school off of the monies that we get from state and funders and private funders and the federal government. And so the resistance to actually transforming that system is going to be stiff. It has always been stiff. But if we can think about it from a perspective of how we reinvent ourselves, so that if we have a lessened need for child protection, how do we create opportunities for those child protective workers to do preventive work under another title, where they still maintain employment, but they're not doing harm to kids and families? Can we get with that? So putting together systems, workforce development, public will, research, accounting, budget, fiscal matters, how we redo contracts has a lot to do with how quickly we can make those shifts. And then one other theme that came up yesterday before I go a little bit deeper into the presentation itself is, Corey said it well, and it's something that I've said myself for a number of years, is that work is not about blaming or trying to shame people or make people feel guilty or angry. I do want to add the anger piece, because this work is for Black, brown, and white folks. It's not just for white folks. And so some may feel shame. I don't know a lot of African Americans that feel shame, but anger is a thought and a reaction that comes up for me. And one of the reasons why I find, one of the many reasons, it's not the only reason, but it's one I just want to lift up, why many African American or Black and brown folks get angry is because we make an assumption sometimes that white folks understand what racism is. We make the mistake of assuming that there's this deep body of knowledge that exists within each white body. And what I've found over the 25-something years that I've had the privilege to do this work is that most white folks that I've come across don't have a clue about what racism is until we start talking about it. And I'll give you an example. I'm going to sit down. I had knee replacement surgery, so I had to balance standing and sitting. Imagine a person who is confined to a wheelchair. And imagine what the top of the mind issues are for him or her on a daily basis. To me, it would be things like, are there automatic door openers? Are the hallways and the doorways wide enough? Is there a wheelchair lift? Is there a ramp to access the building? Are there curb cuts to get from the parking lot to the sidewalk and then to the building? Are the accoutrements in the restrooms appropriate for those who have challenges with their physical abilities? Those are some of the top of the mind issues that I would imagine a person who's in a wheelchair thinks about on a daily basis. because his or her survival, his or her mobility is dependent upon it. Does their workstation or their school desk provide access for a wheelchair? For persons who are not wheelchair bound and who are not necessarily taking care of someone who's wheelchair bound, those are not top of the mind issues. Sure, when we see someone in a wheelchair, we may have some thoughts about what happened to him or her, those kinds of things. And this is not a blaming of people who don't think about folks in the wheelchair. It's just not part of their lived experience. Persons in wheelchairs would also think about, is there accessible parking? Well, I kind of equate in a weird kind of way this lack of a top of the mind issue about the challenges for people who are in wheelchairs to what whites may be thinking about on a daily basis. In other words, is there really a need for you to think about your whiteness? Are there daily reminders to you that you are white and what that means? And of course, when there are events, when there are things that happen, when there's social unrest, when there's push for new legislation, when people are advocating, when folks are exchanging knowledge and information, then the thought process kicks in. But then, as my interpretation of what was said yesterday, and I'm not putting words in his mouth, but this whole notion of, and it may have been said today, that there would be a natural resistance for whites to keep things as they are. Because although it may not always work for each of you individually, there's clear evidence that it's working. Would you all agree with that? For whites. Now, certainly, it doesn't mean that what whites have accomplished and achieved and acquired, they not work for it. That's not what I'm saying. Quite the contrary. But there is a difference between having assurances or reason to really think that if you work hard, you will be rewarded, versus the millions of black and brown kids in this country who know that their parents work hard every day and still have not been rewarded. Am I making sense here? So it gives each of us either a psychological advantage or challenge. So these kind of things are the kind of things that I wanted to just mention, as a backdrop for the work that I want to do with you today. And Dr. Price is right. The real sessions for me are not trainings. Trainings get into what to do and how to do it. This is about why we need to do it. This is about really grasping why we need to do business differently for children and families in color, and how we need to prepare and train our staff to do that work differently. And having a good heart is necessary, but it's not sufficient. Or having the knowledge about how things work is necessary, but not sufficient. We need both. And so the real sessions are an attempt, one of many attempts to kind of get us in that space of thinking about why we need to do things differently. Oh, that's not mine. Wrong one. But I switched on. So, did y'all see that? I'm very technologically challenged. When I actually learned how to do that maybe about 15 years ago, and I'm still celebrating it. So that kind of tells you, I'm like one of those people who don't acknowledge their birthday as one day they celebrate for the whole month, that kind of thing. I'm one of those kind of folks. So people like Corey and others, I'd be lost without them. So we've got some learning objectives that I hope that I'll be able to accomplish today. The first of which, I do want to introduce some concepts about racial identity formation that help participants identify their own personal and professional points of racial identity and development and how it impacts their understanding and behaviors regarding issues of race and ethnicity. We won't do this one, but when we are working with more time, we would look at a continuum of strategies that folks would use after you have recognized where you are in that identity formation, and think about, for example, is your next step to deal with anti-racism, or is it healing and reconciliation, or is it conflict management? Is it democracy building? What is the next step for you to become a more effective leader? So that's really a typo there, just to be transparent about it. The other objective that should be up here that isn't, and I hope I've got the right PowerPoint up here, is that we really want to provide a number of concepts and definitions and data that will really help you become an even better leader in this work, and to help you understand why courageous conversations are needed, not for the purpose of just talking about it, but to figure out what to do about it. And the conversations precedes and constantly informs what we do. And then in the afternoon, we want to make the day interactive, so that we will use what I often call dyads, where I will ask you to pair up with someone, and I will give you some predetermined questions, and we'll work through that process just so you have an opportunity to think out loud and to actually quote, practice, unquote, how to do this work. These are some thought questions, and they've come up in varying degrees already. The first one is really about concentrated poverty and how it influences how our systems respond to the needs of children and families of color. So whether it's child welfare, juvenile justice, or schools, or law enforcement, or housing, employment, it doesn't matter. How do those systems respond to the needs of children and families and communities of color? And are the responses adequate? And I think we could all agree that because the disparities are so glaring, we could say that those responses are not adequate. It doesn't mean that these are bad people, or you're bad people, or I'm a bad person. It means that we've got to do better. And the data suggests that there's a need to look at that. But this concentration of poverty that the speaker this morning talked about is really huge to this, not only in terms of understanding the connection between poverty and race, but it informs how we need to move forward. The second question is about trauma, and how living in that space of concentrated poverty in racially segregated neighborhoods really kind of predisposes those families to the historic trauma, and how it perpetuates trauma, and other forms of toxic stress for kids and families of color. I still have the opportunity to work with families and young people. We do trauma support groups every Thursday evening for the last 5 years, and it's particularly with victims who've survived gun violence, family members, and so forth. And one of the glaring things that I'm taking away from that is that in these areas of concentrated poverty, there's so much trauma you can't even begin to imagine it. It has become so much a part of the way of life. It is so much a part of the lived experience, and the symptoms of hypervigilance and kids, losing interest in things that they once enjoyed, and not trusting folks, and thinking that they're not going to live to be 25, and all those kinds of things are manifestations of the trauma that's going on in these communities. Not to mention the fact that when slavery, quote, was ended, unquote, there were no therapists that I'm aware of that was there to greet the freedman and the freed woman to process that pain. And so all of that pain followed our ancestors from the one side of slavery to the new side of slavery, which was convict leasing and sharecropping and some other things. And we talk about that maybe in another session. But just to be mindful of the fact that not only do the kids and families that we serve experience trauma on a daily basis, but many of us or many of our friends who work in these systems live in those same neighborhoods. And so some of us are nothing but more than a banana peel in the grave away from that ourselves. And then there's this whole vicarious trauma where you haven't been shot at, but you know somebody who has. You haven't been a victim of domestic violence, but you know somebody who has. You have not lost a loved one to gun violence, but you hear about it all of the time. And it affects how we move on a daily basis, how we move in and out different space. The third one is about how the stereotypes rooted in race and ethnicity help perpetuate, how those stereotypes influence who gets removed, who gets detained, who gets arrested, who gets petitioned, who gets adjudicated. And you know, Corey and others talked about this whole notion of a narrative, and it's an invitation for us to think about how long that narrative has been here. I mean, this notion of people of African descent being less than didn't just start in the 1980s or the 1990s. We are in, if you use the settlement in Jamestown in 1619, we are in the 400th year of this country's existence versus a colony, a set of colonies, and then as a nation, where that notion of inferiority became a part of the very DNA of this country. And so conversations about implicit bias help us to understand that even if we're not consciously embracing those negative messages, we've heard them. And when we are tired, when we are hungry, when we are frustrated, when we feel unappreciated, when we're overworked, that's space for those stereotypes to seep into our behavior and our mindsets. And that hence the unconsciousness of it. So I wouldn't necessarily say that implicit bias is racism or synonymous with racism, but it is rooted in it. Its foundation, its very existence is predicated upon the existence of racism. And so how does that influence when we make decisions? And we say that poverty should not be a reason for removing kids, but we do it all the dead blasted time. And structurally, one of the reasons why is because our definition of neglect is so vague. It leaves a lot of room for subjectivity, which again is where our existing systems play out and our existing biases have room to surface. And then the last one is about critical partners. And who do we need to have at the table, not only for child welfare reform or transformation, but in these other systems? And how do we, all of you have touched on in varying degrees, we've used language service integration, we've used community partnerships. I think now one of the paradigms is public health. But all of those are basically saying that the needs of our children and families are not limited to just the issue of safety. We really have to be looking at the whole person. And even though we may specialize in an area, that's only dealing with one part of it. And think about it from a health perspective. Everybody that's involved with a patient is committed to that patient's well-being. You've got anesthesiologists, you've got surgeons, you've got the nurses, you've got the surgeons, you've got the occupational therapists, you've got the lab technicians, you've got the people who clean the bedrooms, you've got people that, all of those folks, the folks in nutrition, everybody's got their role, but it's all about that patient. And so from a public health, from a service integration, from a community partnership perspective, this notion of realizing that we need partners is really important. And whatever you want to call it, the fact that that hasn't changed. This quote is one that I like to start off with because it challenges us, it challenges me, and I invite you to be on the journey with me, to think more deeply. It says, when another person's welfare means more to you than your own, only then can you say you love. And anything else is just give and take or business as usual. And so that brings up a couple of things for me. One is that this is about heart work, heart, not heart, where we really have to recognize how racism dehumanizes us and how it suggests that to us that because of the color of our skin, that somehow there's something innately and inherently different about us that has an influence of positiveness or negativeness or negativity. And then it also suggests to me that we have to understand the issues and we have to be willing to look at the issues and to be reflective and introspective and less about blaming. And so the question for me is, to what extent, if any, does a person's race or class or religion or gender or sexual orientation or age or ability group influence the extent to which we can love them? And if any of those characteristics get in the way of us caring about somebody else, that's why I use this quote, to remind us that we are supporting that negative narrative about inferiority. So I want to define a few terms. I really want to try to go through this quickly. The first one is just this definition of race. And I forgive me if I'm being too elementary, but I introduce it to you not with an assumption that you don't know this definition, but to make sure that everybody is at least considering it as we do our work together today. And this is not the definition. You know, as this work evolves, we define it and massage it and so forth. But it is a social construct. In other words, there's nothing scientific about this idea of racial differences based on the markers or the biological traits that people have. It is clearly and distinctly a social idea that is used to advantage some over others, on the basis of their race and their access to power and resource is influenced by how one looks. That is the way this country has been. So if you're identifying with whiteness, this is not to make you feel like you were back there when a colony was established in 1619, or that you were living when the riots in Rosewood and Tulsa and East St. Louis were occurring in the red summer of 1917 and 1919 in the 1920s. It's not even to suggest that, with the exception of me and maybe, I don't see anybody that looks like they're as old as me, but if you were born in 52, 53, you know, a year or two around the time Brown versus Board of Education, it's not to suggest that you or I were perpetrators of that segregation. But what I am suggesting is that we are here now. We're here right now. And if we say that at worst we may be guilty of implicit bias, what are we doing on a daily basis to undo Jim Crow segregation? And so a lot of folks, when we started doing this work in 2000, were like asking, so why are we talking about race? Didn't we have a civil rights movement? Didn't we change all of that? And the answer is absolutely we did. But we're now in a stage of retrenchment. So this concept of progress and retrenchment is a repeating cycle in American history. The first one that I can think of was right after the Civil War, during the first Reconstruction. That was progress. By 1877, 1878, this nation was saying, look, we're tired of all this help the freedmen, freed woman crap. We need to get back to business as usual. And then after the Civil Rights Movement, it happened again. We're tired of this Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, Robert Kennedy, Viola LaRosa, Fannie Lou Hamer mess. We need to get back to the way we've always done business. And in the South, it says, you can get close, but don't you ever get too big. And in the North, you can get close, but don't you ever think you can get big. Did I say that right? In the South, you can get close, just don't get too big. In the North, you can get big, just don't get too close. So segregation is really strong and powerful in the Midwest and the North. I haven't been in the South for a while. I lived in Memphis for a little bit, but I think segregation is still alive and well. It just may vary from place to place, and we're still as segregated as we ever were. We just don't have the signs up. We just don't have the colors only stuff, but real estate agents and banks and lending institutions are still practicing redlining that perpetuates racial segregation. We still have, I think, restrictive covenants that show up through homeowner associations and those kinds of things. So this notion of race being scientific is, excuse my language, boulder dash. Now, these next two terms are terms that in the field sometimes get used interchangeably, and I'm not saying that's wrong, but in the way I invite you to think about this is racial equality is different than racial equity. To say it simply, racial equality is really a process. It's about acknowledging past disadvantages and historic trauma and discrimination and trying to figure out ways to undo it. And so it involves social policy, it involves economic policy that looks at, what are society's major opportunity structures, housing, education, employment, so forth and so on, and having access to that regardless of your race and ethnicity and so forth. But how do we know when we have equality? We talk about we need racial equality, but how do we know it? What does it taste like? What does it look like? What does it feel like? Well, that's where the notion of racial equity comes in. Because to me, and some of us talk about racial equity as a metric for measuring how far we've come in achieving equality. So there are two parts of the whole. And you may not agree with that, and I respect that. But again, this is inviting you to think about this differently, because as we use these terms around the table, when we're trying to figure out how do we reduce disparities, it's important, I think, to think about the difference between process and outcome. And what is the relationship between the two? And so it is, as the definition says here, and this is one of the definitions that we developed when I was at the Aspen Institute. It is about how we distribute resources, tax dollars, funds, grant opportunities, and so forth, how we look at the results of that distribution in terms of good and bad outcomes. And at the end of the day, the outcomes should no longer be predictable by race. If there are bad outcomes, they should be random. It should be just as likely that a black will be poor as a white would be poor. It should be just as likely that a black or Latino is in child welfare as a white is in child welfare. It should be just as likely for a black or Latino to be wealthy as it is for a white to be wealthy. It is about a black and a Latino and a Native American having employment at the same opportunity and rate as whites. And right now, we know we don't have that. So in my humble opinion, we don't have equality yet. And so the question that I posed earlier about why are we still talking about race? Because we don't have equality. And the evidence is very clear. And I'll jump ahead of a slide. So when we're looking at the data, some folks would say, well, yeah, I mean, we know that blacks are more likely to be poor and more likely to have involvement with criminal justice, juvenile justice, yada, yada, yada. I mean, isn't that the way it's always been? There are two, I think, really influential, dominant frames that often come into play when we're interpreting and analyzing the data. One is that basically says that poverty has nothing to do with structural disadvantage. It's because the people who are poor are pathologically dysfunctional. There's something wrong with those people. it is consistent and in keeping with that historic narrative that started in 1619 and before up to now. And even though we may not consciously embrace it, but when we see it, many of us, not this present company excluded, when we see it, was like, well, isn't that the way it's supposed to be? The other argument is that poverty does have to do with systems and structures and a lack of opportunity based on race. So I asked you, which one have you most often heard? The one about is something wrong with those people, or something wrong about the opportunities that those people have to advance? Which one have you most often heard? Don't be shy. Okay? So, you know, we say things like, well, life is about choices and yada, yada, yada. Let me make it overly simplified. If I go to a restaurant with this young lady here, and she's got a Visa card with a credit limit of $5,000, and she's got $4,500 left she can spend, and I go in there with a debit card that has a limit of $30. We both can look at the menu. We both can walk in that door. We both can order from that menu, but ain't nowhere in the world I'm gonna be able to order what she can order if her order is more than $30. But I had the opportunity. I mean, the choice. Now she can loan me $5 and I might be able to get a little, but you understand what I'm saying here. You know, so this thing about life is about choices, that's a microaggression to me. Now, one person's microaggression is not necessarily the same for others, but that to me is a microaggression. It's a slap in the face, but it's a testimony to the fact that the person that's saying that has seen evidence that if you work hard, you will be successful. But it's also important to point out that there are people in Black and brown communities that work hard every day, working at Kmart's, working at Sam's, working at Walmart, working at the gas station. It's hard work, but the financial benefits are not the same. And I know people who have degrees who are making minimum wage, and they're Black and brown folks. So, but if you live in segregated space, you don't get to see those people. We just assume that, well, if they want to do better, they would do better. So those two frames influence very heavily how we interpret the disparity data. So I just think you should be aware of that. The young lady talked about structural racism this morning. Again, this was a definition that we developed as a template for the better definitions that you all are coming up with and will come up with. But it's the many factors that come together to perpetuate racial hierarchies in our society. And don't think for a minute that segregation wasn't pervasive. We often think about segregation in terms of schools or water fountains. Cemeteries were segregated, hospitals were segregated, child welfare was segregated. It goes on and on. Housing was segregated. Opportunities to finance were segregated. Abilities to serve on the courts and to vote was segregated. The ability to serve in the military or the armed forces was segregated. It affected every aspect of life. And so to think that, oh, because people in child welfare are good people, I looked at some data. There was Dorothy Roberts did a book and her talked about in her book, The Color of Child Welfare. And she talked about how there was a group of people that did what we would call an environmental scan of child care and agencies that were working with kids who were having involvement with foster care. And over 70% of those systems that were part of that screen served white kids only. And 35 of them served Black kids only because the other agencies would not serve those Black kids. And 264 of them served other kids except Black kids. So child welfare and public agencies have a history of segregation. And so looking at our organizational and national values and policies and beliefs and culture and history and stereotypes is really what structural racism begins to invite us to think about. Did y'all see that? That was another one. I stumbled up on that one. I thought my computer was crashing when it first did it. So, again, you all may be familiar with these things, so if I'm sharing something with you that you already know, I think that's a good thing because that means we're on the same page. But we think about 4 levels of types of racism. Internalized racism, this notion of inferiority and superiority, has to do with the messages and the opportunities that are constant in the lives of people and how those messages and opportunities are driven by race. And then the interpersonal, in terms of how we interface with each other. And that's the one that most of us think about, where it's intentional, where it's overt. But then there's this notion of institutional racism, where within a system, there are policies that intentionally and unintentionally disadvantage on the basis of race. And then structural is all of those. Now, your definition may be different, and it is okay, but this is how we think about it. And all of those things inform implicit bias. So a race equity framework, as I think about it, it's basically, in a nutshell, it is about stakeholders at every step in the process of trying to improve outcomes are able to ask and adequately answer the question, how is this going to affect Black and brown people? And to not just ask it, but to have a commitment to answer it in a way that achieves equity, which means that the outcomes will be random and not predictable by race. And so my comment this morning about all of us continuing to go through this learning opportunity to really understand how pervasive this construct of race is important, because in the absence of that, at some point around the table, folks will start rolling their eyes when it's, well, Cattivo keeps bringing up that thing about race. You know that's his thing. And so Cattivo gets marginalized. And so if folks, when I start talking, or the person who's advocating for equity starts talking, folks' ears close up. They start working on their phones. They start looking on their laptop. They excuse themselves to the bathroom. And then when that person finishes, okay, now we can get back to business. It has been like that for a long time. And in some circles, it is still like that. And so while it is easy to say that we need to have the ability to talk about it all the time, it is not as easy to do. And so this afternoon, again, I'll go through a couple of things that will give us a chance to continue to practice how we do that, because it's very important. And then, as I said, to not just talk about it, it's good to have task force and committees on race equity and so forth. That's structurally and institutionally, that says folks are paying attention to it. But when I was talking to folks up in Nassau County that have begun to do some really good work around blind removals, and everybody knows what blind removals are, right? It's basically where a CPS worker goes out responding to a report, an allegation of abuse and neglect, and they do the home visit and they check things out. And when they come back, there's a blind removal committee that then looks at that information, with the exception of the fact that the CPS worker is not disclosing the child and family's color. They're not saying where they live. They're not talking about their income. They're taking away all of those indicators that will help people figure out, oh, those are Black folks, because they live in zip code, yada, yada, yada. Or those are Latinos, they live in such and such a neighborhood. All that's stripped away. And the people on that committee are looking at the facts with, quote, an unbiased eye. To me, that is one of the most progressive race equity strategies out there today, because it is really looking at how to address this issue at the point of entry. But one of the things that they learned when I talked to the folks who headed that up, and she said I could share this. She said they put the cart before the horse. They formed the committees, they started looking at the data, but they didn't have a race equity framework. They were not yet ready to talk about race. And somebody mentioned it yesterday about how do you deal with disparities and reduce it without talking about racism? The juvenile justice system tried that for years. I sat on some of those committees. They talked about disparities in juvenile justice, but they didn't want to talk about race. And I'm like, how do you do that? Not a knock on those individuals. They weren't ready. They weren't comfortable with looking at the real stories. So this is about consciously wanting to address it. So the purpose is really to raise awareness, to create space for the discussions, to implement an action plan, and to improve outcomes. So if it's not about improving outcomes, then it's not about equity. Now, these next two schematics are very similar, but they are different, and it's an attempt to lift up where we place emphasis on defining what's contributing disparities from two perspectives. One is when we are not talking about race and structural racism, and the other one is when we are. So in child welfare, one of the factors that we always look at is individual and family level behavior. We look at risk factors and those kind of things, and we should. Then others of us look at the lack of community level supports and resources, and we should. And some will look at those and pay less attention to those. Others of us will look at the fact that there are not enough appropriate permanent homes for these kids, and so one of the reasons why they languish in care and have longer periods of stay. And then there's the poverty thing. What do you notice about all of those circles in terms of their size? They're the same size, aren't they? At least they're supposed to be. Yeah. What do you notice about the relationship of those circles? They're touching, they're interconnected, they're overlapping, right? Combined, they tell a story that helps us figure out why disparities, or what may be, why they exist, or what's contributing to it. What about that one? Is that the same size as the other ones? Is it connected with the others? And so historically and typically what happens is race is an afterthought. When there's funding for it, we do it. When the funding goes away, excuse the colloquialism, we ain't doing it. When there's a crisis, a police shooting, an unfortunate child death, anything that has racial implications, race will come up. But then once the fervor dies down, it goes away. And then when it does come up, other important issues, excuse the expression, will trump race. I didn't mean to go there, right? And so hence this notion about equity versus racial equity. Other things that are extremely important, like oppression on the basis of gender or sexual orientation or ability group or class, also get lumped in there. But they get lumped in there because those are issues that whites can directly relate to. And it is harder for whites to relate to the race issue. So the race issue becomes subordinate. It gets pushed or maintained on the lower rung of the hierarchy. Are you all still with me? I'm not saying this to make people feel uncomfortable, but if you are, it's with respect and love. Because this is about stretching. If you ever involved in athletics, if you're gonna be better at whatever it is you are, you're gonna feel some pain. But you need to know the difference between pain that comes from advancing versus an injury. We're not trying to injure anybody, okay? Now, when we shift this and kind of turn it upside down and look at how how structural racism and equity can be applied, those same circles begin to look like this. What do you notice about these circles? They're all the same size. And what about their relationship? They're all connected. Is race the biggest one? No, because it's not always about race. And we need to be able to take a look at that, and at the table of being transparent and transformative, we need to be able to say, look, we've studied this, we've looked at this, Cattivo, this is not about race. And Cattivo needs to be able to say, you're right. But we shouldn't always be looking for examples and reasons to take race off the table, which is what we typically do. So it's a both and. Now I put race in the middle because there's a closer correlation between race and a lack of supports and resources in the community and poverty than it is about individual and family level behaviors. Although the dominant narrative would put that right on top of race, because that says there's something wrong with those people. And in the mental health field, there's a paradigm shift that I think gets applied here very well when we talk about, with respect to trauma, we talk about not asking what's wrong with a person, but instead asking what happened to them. And the same thing applies when we're talking about race, as opposed to saying and thinking, there's something wrong with those people. We should be asking what happened to them. What is the historic experience? How is that experience different, but in some ways similar in lesser degrees to that of those who identify as white? Because whites have not had an easy walk either. The first large group of kids that came into foster care through the orphan train were whites. They were poor white immigrant kids. I think Charles Lauren Brace started in the 1870s or something, the 1850s. And there was a huge influx of Irish in this country. And the Irish have, and to some extent still have, negative stereotypes associated with them. And then you also had an influx of Italians and Poles and people of the Jewish faith. And so initially, those were the kids that were on that orphan train, not black kids, not Native kids. So the child welfare system is set up to say we need to have a response to kids who come from families that there's something wrong with them. But then somehow by the time we got to the 1960s, when the foster care and ADC were combined and funding was made available at higher rates to bring kids into foster care, the numbers shifted. And all of a sudden, blacks went from being underrepresented to overrepresented. And it is a lot about money. Title 4E was passed, I think, in 1980 under the Adoption Assistance and Child Welfare Act. That's an uncapped allocation for child welfare or for foster care. The interesting thing about it is more money goes towards removal than does towards in-home services. So there are agencies and organizations that are making money off of the removal of black kids and Native kids. Whereas as somebody said yesterday, white families are more likely to get services in home. Now we've got this Families First Prevention Act, which is a great thing, that allows in-home services for all kids. But if we don't apply a race equity lens to it, it's only going to perpetuate that advantage for white kids and disadvantage black kids, because the system is already in place to remove black and Native kids. Would you agree? Okay. So, leading with race, using an equity lens. These are the 5 components of the framework that I use. I'm just rushed through them, and I'm not going to be able to cover all these for time's sake, but it starts with data and making an analysis of that. Then it comes to applying a structural racism lens or an analysis, talking about or looking for those policies that both intentionally and unintentionally disadvantage kids. I think about the Wilder versus Sugarman case in New York, I think in 1973, something like that. That was a case where the New York ACLU basically sued the commissioner and several other commissioners and numerous volunteer agencies because they were deliberately using public funds to support religious organizations, and the religious organizations that got the best funding and the best supports were Catholic and Jewish. And it came about because of this young lady whose last name was Wilder, had about 12 different placements, all of which resulted in her being in a juvenile detention facility while she was awaiting placement. Now, this is not a knock on the Jewish and the Catholic child caring agency, because they have a reputation for doing a very good job. But they, on the other hand, took kids in on the basis of religious preferences. Most black folks are not Catholics, and fewer are Jewish. And so a good portion of the public dollars for foster care placement was being denied black kids because of their religious orientation and preference. I can't say that that was deliberately designed to disadvantage black kids, but it did. And so there are those intentional and there's those unintentional. And so if we apply equity lens, we're asking ourselves, if we push this policy, how is it going to affect black and brown kids? And having the capacity to ask and answer that question over and over and over again. Conducting a benefits and burdens analysis, who pays for it, who benefits from it, what are the implications for taxes, and how in this era of austerity, we're like, well, I want fewer taxes and so forth and so on, and who gets cut first? You know, we always hear about the welfare budget. Welfare budget is always minuscule compared to the military budget and some other things. But those are the ones that get lobbed out there first, and people say, yeah, because those people don't deserve it anyway. They don't want to work. They just keep having kids, and they want to live off the welfare and live off my tax dollars. It's what we hear over and over and over and over and over again. It's part of the narrative. There's something wrong with those people. And I'm not using my tax dollars to let this lazy so-and-so or voodoo. You all understand. You know the story. You've heard it. I'm not saying you've said it, but you've heard it. You've heard it at the bars. You've heard it at the dinner table. You've heard it at holiday events with your families. You read it in the newspaper. Practicing cultural competence and cultural sensitivity using the racial equity framework, and then monitoring the outcomes. So those are the 5 parts to that. I want to just kind of go through the data for a minute and invite us to look not just at child welfare, but how disparities exist across a really broad spectrum of social dimensions. And think about how all those things are affecting opportunities for the kids who come into our care. So it's not just what happens in the home or what doesn't happen in the home, it's what's happening all around these kids. So here's the frame that I talked about earlier. Poverty not caused by structural factors related to race and class. It is caused by family dysfunction, cultural pathology, and lawlessness, particularly black culture. The cause of it is black poverty is attributed to this whole subculture, which, by the way, is the result of folks not having access to the dominant culture. So underground kind of economies emerge in that space. Transform from adaptation to poverty and basic character failure. Something wrong with those people. So what should we do? What should be our response? Well, we need to restore law and order. We need to implement a war on drugs, that is, punish people for drug abuse. We need to resist the civil rights legislation, and we need to resist further implementation of anti-poverty programs. This is an oversimplification of a very dominant framework that has influenced research, has influenced policy, has influenced practice, has influenced funding. Yes, sir.
I know I feel like this research actually been getting out of point in the idea. So the first guy is his frame, but his causation and response, I don't think that was all. I feel like it was how his information was used through the process.
Couldn't agree with you more. And that's, I mean, I appreciate you lifting that point. But one of the powerful points of what you're saying is how an idea has broad influence and how people latch on to things and they don't necessarily understand the true meaning of it. And how the reverse of that, we latch on to racial equity, but do we really understand the true meaning of it? So do you understand what I'm saying? So the power of that was consistent with that historic narrative about there's something wrong with those people, whether it's the Dred Scott decision, whether it's the 3/5 clause in the articles of, in the Constitution of the United States, whether it was Plessy versus Ferguson, whether it was the Supreme Court rulings after the first Reconstruction Act or the Civil Rights Act, whether it was Milliken v. Valley, 20 years after Brown versus Board of Education. It is still saying, in effect, we don't want to live around those people. We don't want our kids going to school with those people. We want a separate school district for our kids versus them. We want our kids to have an unfair advantage over those people. And that helps inform that. Yes, sir.
Well, regardless of who, if he said it or if he just found out he couldn't work, that's absolutely true. I can tell you from this. I mean, that's just unbelievable. I mean, I've heard that a million times in the past. I probably said it myself.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
I do. And one of the takeaways from what you just said, sir, is the transparency in you that you started, and this is what I'm taking for now. I want to put words in your mouth, but you started off with this assumption and you're not buying into that anymore. So to me, what that says is that people can change when they want to, when there's an incentive, when there's information to inform the change. It gives me hope once again, and hopefully it gives you all hope that just because somebody talked, I think it was Corey or somebody yesterday talked about meeting people where they are. And I think that's important. However, wherever we are at this time in our development is where we're supposed to be. The question is that where we want to stay? So this is one way that people look at that disparity data and interpret it. The other one says that poverty is caused by structural and historic factors related to race, class, and ethnicity. Causation, root causes of criminal behavior in Black communities stem from poverty created by racial and class biases. Response should be restore law and order by implementing civil rights legislation, anti-poverty, that is war on poverty programs, and more treatment for substance abuse. Now, the way this stuff plays out in terms of specifically child welfare, with the first part of it, this dysfunction thing, so we say these kids come from dysfunctional families, so our response is what? To take them, to remove them. And the focus is on the child, because it's about the child's safety. Now, the paradigm is shifting, and we're getting smarter and smarter about this, but for a long time, and still in a dominant way, safety is the foundation of child welfare. And then we say permanence and try to do permanence. We've got ASFA and some other things to help get us there. But the well-being part is just like a good phrase to end the sentence. But we don't have any resources to do that. We don't have any people any aftercare workers that can go into communities and connect these families with employment and better housing. This is just, I mean, this is kind of old data, but it's not much different now. It basically, these are 3 clusters based on age and race/ethnicity. And the first one looks at people age 18 to 64, next one under age 18, and then under age 6. The dark blue bar is for whites, the middle blue bar is for Blacks, and the other one is for Latinos. Without even being able to see the numbers, you can tell that if you just memorize which colors associate with which group, who in each cluster is more likely to be poor. So whether you're 18 to 64, Black folks are more likely to be poor. If you're under age 18, Blacks are more likely to be poor. And under age 6, children are more likely to be poor because they live in poor families. Why is that? Is that equality? Is that equity? Did the civil rights movement do enough to address that? Did we change our systems and how we think sufficiently to make sure that the well-being of these kids no longer looks like that, but where those bars are either non-existent, where nobody's poor, or where they're all equal? Economic mobility. Blacks have a harder time exceeding the family income and wealth of their parents than do whites. So Blacks have, in large measure, generationally done better than their parents, but for Blacks, 66% of Blacks who are in the second quintile surpass surpass their parents' income compared to 89% for whites. That's a disparity. Why isn't it 89-89 or 66-66? In terms of wealth, only 23% of blacks in the middle quintile surpass their parents' family wealth compared to over half for whites. That's a disparity. So when we asked ourselves why are folks more likely to be poor, look at the data. Look at our assumptions. Why are blacks and Latinos and Native in particular more likely to be poor? And is it because there's something wrong with them or because the opportunities are not equal? Blacks are more likely to be stuck in the bottom or to fall from the middle than are whites. Over half of blacks raised in the bottom of the family income ladder remain stuck, compared to only a third for whites. Half of blacks in the middle of the family income ladder fall to the bottom two rungs as adults compared to just under a third for whites. This is not beating up on white folks' day. It may feel like this, but that's not the intention. The intention is to say to you that we got some catching up to do. If you didn't learn this in civics class, if you didn't learn this in sociology, if you didn't learn this in history, if you didn't learn this in social study, we need to learn it now if we're going to improve outcomes for black and brown kids. So I know, trust me, I know what it's like to try to catch up. And all of us need to be supportive of each other as we try to catch up. And we need to be patient with folks who are not getting it and not assume that they're resisting to be a bad person, quote unquote. Some of this stuff is hard to accept, especially when you heard it from your parents or your granddad or grandma or from your teacher that you loved and respected the most, or your guidance counselor or your priest or your rabbi or your imam or your partner. It is hard to hear it because it's caused us to undo something that we've been taught all our lives. But we can do it, as testimony by the gentleman in the back and others in this room. This is a graph that kind of shows the unemployment rate over a period of time, not just a point in time, from 1973 to 2014. On the basis of race and ethnicity. This lower blue line represents white unemployment. The middle one is Hispanics, and the top one is blacks. Again, if you can't see the numbers, you know, the percentages on the side or whatever, or the year at the bottom, from 1973 to 2014, you can just look at the colors and know that blacks are more likely to be unemployed. And we have a saying that when white folks have a cold, black folks got pneumonia. That when it's bad for white folks, it's really bad for black folks. I have yet to find any point on this continuum where the unemployment rate went down for blacks and went up for whites. But somehow, and the same with Hispanics, but somehow you get people saying, well, those immigrants are taking our jobs. Your granddaddy was an immigrant. Come on. Your grandmama was an immigrant. Now all of a sudden, now that the wealth and opportunities has become constant, everybody in this country is an immigrant, with the exception of African people. The ones that we call immigrants and the native folks and the folks that we call Mexicans. This was their land. California, Arizona, New Mexico, that was part of Mexico. That was their land. That wasn't our land. We took that land in a war in 1848. This was their land. So you got people we call Native Americans, and we got people we call Mexicans. This was their space. So when we get in this thing about they're taking our jobs, you took their job. You took their land. You took their language. Spanish is not the dominant language in this country. English is. You understand what I'm saying? Not you personally, but your ancestors created a system that's benefiting you now. And you're able to be misinformed and to say they're taking your job. You know, if we think about job thing as a pie. You know, the pie chart with the slices, and folks say, well, you know, if I give up a slice of my pie, then that means I'm going to have less. So why should I give Cattivo a piece of my pie? Because I like pie and I want some pie. But we get stuck in saying, well, you know, there are only so many slices in that pie, right? Have we ever thought about maybe we should just bake another doggone pie? I mean, we claim to be the wealthiest and the smartest country in the world. You mean to tell me we can't figure out how to bake another pie? Come on.
It's like somebody without shame will say, to me, you're tired, you're hungry, you're poor, you're in mass.
That's right.
That's not what's happening.
It is. And give me your land in the process. In terms of education, school to prison pipeline, I know this is, you know, if anybody in here is an educator, this is not beating up on schools, but to make a long story short, and I've done a lot of work in schools and with schools, when kids come to school after having witnessed or heard about a shooting the night before, or they attended a funeral for the death of some of their loved ones, and we expect them to show up that next day and be fully engaged in conversations about math and biology and physics and yada, yada, yada. It's not going to happen, and it doesn't happen. So why do we not have the sufficient number of therapists and social workers and counselors in those schools to help identify their trauma early so that those kids can succeed? But somehow on this benefit and burdens thing, it's like, who's going to pay for that? And then do we have therapists that are comfortable and culturally competent, culturally sensitive, that are willing and able to go into those schools? I ran a program called Caring Communities in St. Louis that actually got national and international renown back in the latter part of the 80s and 90s. And one of the striking things I found about this was that we had a hard time identifying white staff. I interviewed several, and I can picture them now, sharp candidates, until they went home and told their husband or dads where they was gonna be working. They're like, no, you ain't. You ain't working over there in that neighborhood. And he said he wants you to work after hours. He wants you to be on a flex schedule. He's talking about this 24/7 thing. I don't think so. So how well prepared are we if you identify with whiteness, or if you don't, if you're African American? How willing and able and prepared are you to work in those neighborhoods, in those homes? Or is it easy to take those kids out so we don't have to visit in that neighborhood, but when we do the home visits and so forth? So you got kids black kids with learning disabilities, and they're disproportionately affected as follows. African American students made up 17% of the public school population in that year, 2000. They made up 34% of the suspensions. Special ed students, regardless of the race and ethnicity, made up about 9% of the population and 32% of the kids who entered the juvenile justice system nationwide. African American students with learning disabilities were 3 times more likely to be suspended than white kids with learning disabilities, and 4 times more likely to end up in correctional facilities. So kids are dropping out first mentally and then physically. And then unfortunately, some of them are ending up in the juvenile justice system, or experiencing an early death, or ending up in the adult correctional system. And it's a waste of tax dollars. If we could do more on the front end, we could save a lot of lives and have more resources to build this nation and make it really what it purports to be. Just a couple of more, and then I want to move on. The suspension rates are high for preschool kids. Black kids are suspended preschoolers more often than white preschoolers. There was a study done up in Minnesota where they used this concept. They were focusing on how the Family Medical Leave Act and the requirement for mothers to go back to work before they were emotionally prepared to go back to work was adversely impacting children's behavior. And so they would do this little experiment. Some of you researchers would like this, I think, and probably familiar. I think they call it serve and response, where they would have the infant in a baby seat or laying on the bed, and the mother would be instructed to not show any visible connection with the child. So the child is laying on the bed first, you know, babies are, they kick their legs and blow bubbles and spit and pass gas and all that kind of stuff, you know, trying to make you laugh and that, and the mother's told to just stare at the kid. No emotional response. So at first the baby's still trying to get you to laugh and hug him and kiss him, and then eventually the baby starts getting frustrated. And the cortisol levels in their brain begins to increase, affecting the very brain's architecture, right? And so they followed those kids to adolescence and adulthood, and many of those infants had really bad outcomes, the ones that didn't get the interventions that they needed as a result of mom not having the energy to be emotionally present. She hadn't put on her mask, so therefore she couldn't, on the airplane, so she couldn't do it for the baby. And there are countless numbers of kids now going to school with those same challenges because mothers are having to go to work before they're ready and before they should. African-American kids are suspended more than white kids, and African-American girls are suspended and expelled more than anybody except African-American males. And folks, our over-focus on black males needs to shift. We have neglected girls and women way too long. I'm not saying we shouldn't be focusing on the black male, but we've been neglecting black girls and black women for way too long. And now that is the largest and increasing population that's going into prison. Right now, the percentage of women going into prison has increased significantly. And I think in part is because we've been ignoring them. Too many of our initiatives about black males. And again, I'm not saying we shouldn't be focusing on black males, but what about black girls? What about Latina? What about Native American? How do we bake another pie to make sure that the resources are there for them? Yes, sir.
Think about Dr. Kelly's work in this area, you know, in terms of safe preschool children. You know, I was at the 03 conference, and I had the opportunity, great opportunity. Couldn't keep up, but very opportunity. Simply, Dr. Lewis from Canadian University, and Dr. Hamilton, he was talking about that in these situations, in some of these preschools, that there's a deficit.
Say that last part, it was what?
A deficit in empathy.
Yeah.
I was really struck by that.
Empathy on the part of the staff or the children? Yeah. You know, I would go two places with that. That is a striking but true observation in reality. One, I go back to my opening comments about secondary trauma, that folks are overworked and underpaid and underappreciated and overly qualified to work particularly in early childhood development. It is designed for people to leave. You got to go through all that certification and you're still going to make barely above minimum wage. Now, some people can stick with it, like parents as teachers and that kind of stuff, if that's a second income and they want to stay, you know, be a partial stay-at-home mom or something. But for the most part, the need, and because of TANF, the need for more early childhood staff exceeds the supply. And so we're getting people coming in that space who have their own trauma, not only secondary trauma, but they've experienced trauma themselves. And they don't have the capacity to be empathetic because they're experiencing too much harshness. But the other one is thinking about what race has to do with that and how and why, and is there in fact a greater reality that some of those workers that are not showing empathy are predictable by race and class. Okay. This one is about housing, and this is the big elephant in the room, folks. You know, we've had, again, the young lady this morning talked about redlining and restrictive covenants and land use, zoning issues and so forth. And That was deliberate. The Federal Housing Administration in the 1930s put together a scheme that basically said, keep neighborhoods segregated and you will get funding to create the suburbs. You let more than 2% of black folks move in that space and the value of that property will drop. And so whites would lose out because then they'd have to sell their property for less than value. And then when blacks moved in, they jacked up and inflated the prices. And that has happened over and over and over and over and over again. And the story is, well, if you work hard, you'll be able to buy a house, and they don't have a house because they're not working hard. $120 billion has been quoted, went into new housing construction from 1930s to 1960s. Less than 2% of folks who were black had an opportunity to benefit from that. So the suburbs that we see now were racially constructed, and school districts were established in that space. And when people have kids or thinking about having kids, they're looking for school districts that have a good track record, and they're almost always in white neighborhoods. So the color of your skin will determine where a lot of people live, and where you live determines the value of your property. And the value of your property drives the tax base in that community and the ability to provide opportunities for employment and business. Then it also has the implication for whether or not you're going to have sustainable municipal services. And lastly, the overall well-being. So even today, we see now this movement that's called gentrification, right? Everybody's familiar with that term? Gentrification. It's where whites are relocating from recently historic neighborhoods in the suburbs to back into the urban core. That's on the face of it is a good thing, except that in most places they're displacing the people who were stuck there for 2 or 3 generations. So they come in, speculators. We've got places in St. Louis that have been blighted for 30 years or more. And folks own lots that are abandoned and weeds as tall as me. And those people don't even live in St. Louis. They were just waiting for the moment when the demographics would shift, and now whites are coming back in and buying that land for little or nothing. They're buying people's property for tax abatement or for tax debt, $15,000, $20,000, and they're bringing with them their credit, and they can get $200,000 loan to fix up a house that they paid $30,000 for, and the value of it increased to $300,000 just like that. But the people who've been stuck there, who didn't get the city services, who couldn't get a loan at a reasonable rate, who didn't have the support to revitalize their property, they're being pushed out. So gentrification can be a good thing if it doesn't result in displacement. But when whites are moving in, it's important that whites understand what's going on and to not assume that those neighborhoods went bad because black people, was something wrong with them and they didn't keep up their property. The banks didn't loan the money. And when whites moved out of the urban core, they took the tax dollars and their supports and resources with them. It was interesting to notice how in the 60s, we went from not having any black mayors to a whole bunch of black mayors. That's because white folks had fled. So there were few white people in the city. So yeah, you was gonna have a black mayor in Cleveland and in Chicago and other places, in Detroit, because white folks had split. But the thing is that folks would say, yeah, as soon as you put black folks in office, the neighborhood went to, held in a handbasket. Not quite. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, actually, I'm from Detroit.
Okay.
Detroit area, and actually family who live in Detroit. And
I'm getting ready to get in trouble. No, I'm just kidding.
you're exactly describing what happened. Detroit is historically a black community, and with the influx of white and millennials coming in, the rent has gone up like tenfold. My brother went from paying, a couple hundred for the house that he lives in to over 1,000. It's
Wow.
leading to more disparity among the African American community in Detroit, because now they can't pay for the rent, and they've been living in that place for 10, 15, 20 years. So
Yes.
it's like a real life experience that we've got.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And so I wish I was making this stuff up. But it's important, I think, because I believe everybody in this room cares, that it's important that you understand what's going on, because there's so much stuff that happens around us that we don't even know what the policy is. We just see things happening and we make assumptions. And we miss an opportunity to have an impact. And child welfare may be your focus, but these kids are being displaced in that space. If you just want to focus on child welfare. So housing segregation, a typical white lives in a neighborhood that looks something like this: 75% white, 8% black, 11% Hispanic, 5% Asian. Blacks make up more than 8% of the population in this country. Y'all know that, don't you? And Hispanics make up more than 11% of the population. A typical black lives in a neighborhood that is 45% black. Blacks don't make up 45% of the population. Maybe 17, 18, or 12 or 13, depending on where you look. Whites certainly make up more than 35%. So where black folks are living, white folks ain't trying to live there. And where white folks live in majority, they ain't trying to have black folks live there. Typical Hispanic lives in a neighborhood that's 45% Hispanic. They don't make up 46% of the population either. An Asian, a typical Asian neighborhood is 22%. And you know Asians don't make up 22% of the population. This is segregation, folks. It's a dissimilarity index, where you're basically looking at it from the same perspective of disproportionality. However people are made up in the general population, that's how you should see them dispersed around the region. And if you find that, for example, blacks make up 10, 15 or 30% of the population in Broward, I'm just using that because I don't know, then in neighborhoods and zip codes, that's the way it should look. But if you go in neighborhoods where blacks make up 70, 80% of the population, that's extreme segregation. So I want to just fast forward. Those are some data on juvenile justice. Yes.
When you shared that slide, what immediately popped out to me was just where you see the percentage of Black Americans that reside in Asian neighborhoods and reside in Hispanic neighborhoods. Black, Spanish people, and then how what I have seen in regard to Asian people and how some of them communicate or see Black Americans. You know, the language that is used about Black Americans in the region that I hear. So that narrative comes down to me.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that. And make no mistake about it, everybody's heard this narrative. Some people get the narrative before they even come here. When you come to the United States, this is where you don't want to live. These are people you don't want to associate with. They come over here miseducated. And they get it reinforced daily, annually, on a decennial basis. Okay? So, yes. But even Asians, it's interesting. Asians, and that's a broad group, they could be Korean, Japanese, Vietnamese, Hmong, Cambodian. And they could have been born here, but they're still viewed as foreigners because they don't look like white folks. It could be 2 or 3 generations, and they're never going to look like white folks because they ain't white. But they look different. They're the others. And they're easily distinguishable. And so they still experience huge discrimination. They just pool their resources and make their survival safe. Pardon me? It was. It was. It was. It was. There was even an important Supreme Court case, Ozawa versus, I think it was United States. Japanese guy that lived in Okinawa, in Hawaii, and was applying for citizenship, 1921, 22, something like that. And he was told because he was not white or Caucasian, he couldn't be a citizen. It's a very important Supreme Court case. So, you know, we've done some stuff. And again, most of us have never heard of this stuff, but it is influencing policy and practice on a daily basis. So I want to just fast forward to just some quick child welfare data. I know I'm running out of time. This is our friend from Casey Family Programs yesterday talked about this decision point model. And when we started to work with the Caseys at the Center for the Study of Social Policy, we embraced this idea of looking at decision points in the child welfare system to figure out where is disparity occurring, what are the policies that are contributing to that, and therefore what should we do? And so this column here represents how kids show up on the basis of race and ethnicity. This one shows children in poverty. This is children who've been victim of maltreatment and abuse. This represents kids who entered child welfare that year. This is kids who are already there, exits and aging out. And so in your work and in your research, you might want to look at what practices are being applied at these decision points to reduce disparities. It has to be with precision, I think. You know, how do you hone in on things like APLA? Was it another applied permanency, living opportunity, blah, 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 blah. And how that unintentionally, but realistically keeps kids in care. And how, on the one hand, relative care and kinship care is really a research would say is a good alternative placement, but it is not permanency. It is still foster care. So how do we move kids from relative placements to permanency? Where are the opportunities for those grandparents or whoever it is to become the adopted or guardians of that family? Where's the policy to support that? Well, Fostering Connections to Success, passed in 2008, offers some opportunities for that. The problem with that is that if you are a convicted felon, then you can't become a licensed foster care home. Well, I skipped over some slides here, but there are 2.3 million people in prison in this country right now, and another 6 million on probation and parole. And 6 out of every 10 of those are Black and brown folks. So that anti-drug act that was passed, the war on drug thing, that punished people for non-violent drug use that now we're talking about making legal and making money off of, has ruined lives. So those kids who have loving grandparents who just got busted for having weed on them or for selling weed, I'm not saying selling weed was good, but in the broader scheme of things, you know, a lot of people smoke weed to cope with trauma. A lot of people drink to cope with trauma. Those are unhealthy coping skills. But nevertheless, that law is disproportionately affecting Black and brown kids. So those kids will not achieve permanency and they'll age out. So there are just ways that this stuff plays out. So I mentioned blind removals as a really good strategy. 10 minutes, thank you. I mentioned blind removals as a strategy for looking at entries and deliberately looking at how race is impacting that. And in Nassau County, the percentage of kids who were removed through a blind removal process who were Black decreased from 55% to 26%, 29%, or basically 30%. And those who did not go through the removal process, it increased from 35% to 45%. So what Dr. Price is pushing and advocating is definitely on point. And learning how to do that and basing research on how that works and what we can learn is really important. Families First Prevention Act, I mentioned that. This is now basically saying that all of the dollars or the bulk of the dollars don't have to go for removal. Now kids can be served in their homes, but we need to apply equity lens to it and a cultural sensitivity perspective so that Black and brown kids have that same opportunity, and the training for staff who would be comfortable working in those homes needs to be built up. This is just a chart that shows kids who are in care 2 years or more. This blue line is Black kids. This kind of a goldish looking line represents Latino kids. This one right here, kind of greenish looking thing. This other one is all kids, and then this one is white kids. And without even looking at the percentages, you see that Black kids are more likely to be in care 2 years or more. That's not temporary. That's not permanency. That's, you know, beginning to spend a lifetime. Yes.
So that's how study. Although I'd like to think that it wasn't because they implemented this matrix, this matrix. But Clark changed the way that they implemented the risk matrix. What's actuarial? What's the risk? Something I'm going to go right on. So I'm wondering if that overlaps with the introduction of the risk matrix, going blind, using the risk matrix. Because that'd be interesting, for me, that'd be interesting. I don't believe the risk. I don't really buy into the risk matrix piece. I mean, the book is making.
I don't know enough about, in my mind right now, the risk matrix, but I'll say this. Blind removals by themselves is not going to change a lot. Because once we determine that these are Black kids or brown kids, now how do we respond? What are the services that we put in place to make sure that it achieves permanency and well-being? So keeping them from coming into the system is great, but then what happens to them, okay? So in terms of a strategy to deal with kids lingering in care, I mentioned the subsidized guardianships. Illinois did a lot of work on that. Fostering Connections provides a federal subsidy for guardianships now. At first, states had to do that with TANF-only dollars and rubber bands and aluminum foil and chewing gum. And so it was very few kids had a chance to actually experience a guardianship placement. But now there's funding for that, and we hope that people are taking advantage of that. This is kids aging out. Excuse me, again, you can see that Blacks are unfortunately leading the pack, and Native kids are in there. This idea of ASFA is a way of, you know, we know that if you put money behind and create incentives for kids to go home, states and agencies will figure out how to do it. So again, to some extent, it's about the money, not so much in terms of the people who are working in it, but how the agencies are designed to respond. So I already talked about the Anti-Drug Act and how it impacted kids. I will say that when the Anti-Drug Act was passed in 1986, the foster care population more than doubled. Largely attributable to the sentencing guidelines associated with that act. And in juvenile justice, the numbers more than doubled. So that one law that said nothing about race had a disproportionate impact on Black and brown communities because the police focused in on poor communities where people were selling drugs on the streets. And I would tell you that some of the best drugs can be found on college campuses. And y'all know what I'm saying is true. Y'all know I'm telling the truth. Some of the best weed, some of the best coke, some of the best meth, some of the best LSD can be found on college campuses, but you don't see police raiding those campuses. And you will not see them raid those campuses. But they would raid the barrios and the ghettos, because that was the public's perception of where the problem existed. I'm just saying. And y'all, does anybody disagree with that fact? Oh, thank you very much. So this last thing, I guess, is the Stanford study in juvenile justice, where the study was looking at the issue of culpability on the basis of race and the extent to which Black juveniles would be held more culpable for a juvenile offense than white juveniles. And here's what they found. Race affected perception of culpability. Black juvenile offenders and adults were viewed much more alike, kids and adults alike. We know that that's not true on the basis of brain development, right? and more blameworthy than similar white juvenile offenders. We had this thing of, well, if that kid got shot, he must have been doing something wrong. He must have been selling drugs. They must have been a gangbanger. Right, wrong place, wrong time was a book written by Dr. Rich. And he talks a lot about how the attitudes in the emergency rooms reflect this notion of, yes, doctors will do what they're supposed to do to save a kid who's on a gurney, but they still think that, well, I'm tired of these kids coming in here gang banging and getting shot up. When are they going to learn? And every kid that gets murdered or gets assaulted in first degree is not a gangbanger. Kids still kill one another just out of anger. They still, based on reputation or wrong identity, or somebody dissed his girlfriend or boyfriend. Those things still do happen, or just being in the wrong doggone place at the wrong time. But somehow we think that when people have a misfortune, they deserve it. And so with that paradigm, it's easier for us to assume that because it happens so often with black and brown kids, they deserve it. And I'm telling you, they don't deserve it any more than anybody else's kids. Yes, sir.
When Trayvon was shot, a lot of my white family members and friends excused his execution, if you will, based on the fact he was positive for THC.
Right.
And I was like, you can't be serious. I mean, this young man was doing nothing wrong.
Yes.
And this guy shot him. I mean, you know, nothing you've done, there's any evidence he was doing anything wrong. He turned to meet somebody he felt was a threat or aggressor, and he was shot down. The guy, but so many of them reached out and clung to the fact. I heard it, well, he was positive for THC.
Yeah.
Half of those people say that were positive for THC.
Might have just lit one up just before the conversation. Yeah, baby, see what really happened was, you know. Was I finished? So it's that kind of thing. So yeah, I appreciate that. Let me just stop here. And after lunch, I want to real quickly take a few minutes just to kind of take you through a framework that has to do with racial identity formation. And then the questions will focus on where are you along that continuum in your personal lives, and where are you along that continuum in your professional lives. And I'm inviting you, we're going to do that because I view all of you as leaders. And I think it's an important opportunity for you to reflect on how you're processing all this information. The information that you came here with, and I suspect you all came here very rich. And certainly the information you got yesterday was very enriching. Hopefully today has added some value. But I want to invite you to reflect on how you see yourselves as a leader when you think about your racial identity, and how you're going to use that to continue to push for change. So we'll do that, and then we'll do the dyad work, and we'll finish. Yes, Corey.
Yeah, I thought I had a thought yesterday that I didn't mention. I just wanted to say through this thing, bright spots, and flower removals, families first. I just want to call attention to the leaders in the room that have a little hole right here at the Capitol that, you know, we can take in Florida, we can take some lessons from Minnesota. It's set to pass. It's on the floor, it's ready to pass. It's in the second reading, the African American Preservation Act. So Rick Moran has submitted a bill that really looks at making these decisions harder in the Black community to remove Black kids. And when it's absolutely necessary, that there's equitable approaches, service array. It's similar to ICWA. Right?
Yes.
When,
Yes.
We say that is also gold standard, but none of the states have adopted that practice model in their work. So if you look, I just wanted to highlight that.
No, that's very good, and it's going to make this work more challenging, because one of the responses that you're going to get is, why do Black people need something special? something different. Same response we got from people when I did work in Minnesota around ICWA. It was like, why did we, and in Iowa, it was like, why do they have to have a separate unit? Well, the answer was because the existing units aren't treating them fairly. And there's a law that exists that says that if you have, I think, what is it, 25% blood associated with one of the 500 something federally recognized tribes, you're eligible for ICWA services. Right. And so it almost reminds me of, I was talking to somebody one time, and the guy was saying, well, why do you guys have a Black Miss America pageant? Because you wouldn't let black women into the white one. Why do we have an African Methodist Episcopal Church? Because the Methodist Episcopal Church didn't let black folks worship at the same level as whites. And so Richard Allen and Absalom Jones created the AM&E. So these things were created as a result of oppression. And the law that you're talking about is a continuum of that effort to try to level the playing field. And folks who want to go to this race neutral, treat everybody the same perspective, it has good intentions, but it does not have good results because we aren't all the same in terms of how we're treated in our walk in life. So I'm gonna let my doctor here break us for lunch.
That's it. That's all I want to do. I mean, this was amazing. We could literally do this for the rest of the day. But I encourage you, use the same number, the phone number to text your questions. All right, we have 6 already. We're going to try to make sure Mr. Cattivo will be able to get to them all. But again, this is where it's important to continue the dialogue. So now I want us to go ahead and break for lunch. Again, I want to encourage you, send your questions in. We want to make sure we try to get to them all. And he's going to come back after lunch for the workshop and be able to address more questions. So please allow yourselves time to eat. We're going to do lunch. Food is outside, right outside, same place. And then enjoy, and then we'll come back to the part B. Make sure you sign into the registration desk, and if you need CEUs, please go ahead and sign in as well.